So welcome. We're really glad you're here. I'm Sara Brumfield with FromThePage. I'm here today with Ben, my partner, and we wanted to tell you about what we've learned from over a decade of running crowdsourcing projects and how that specifically applies to indexing projects. This is part of, we do monthly webinars, but we happen to have 3 in a row that all kind of tie to material that might be of interest to family historians and genealogists, or that sort of same type of material. So there's this one, and then next month we're having a discussion with the Indiana Archives and the Alabama Archives about crowdsourcing genealogy collections. So they've both run really large projects, and we're just going to let them talk instead of us talking, which I think will be fun. And then in December, the Library of Virginia is doing, it's actually a repeat of a presentation they did at a small conference that Ben went to recently, about their Virginia Untold project, specifically indexing their, what is it? I can't read the word.
The Free Negro Registers, which is a really important source for African-American history and genealogy.
Yeah, so 2 super exciting webinars coming up. So if you find this interesting, you might find those interesting as well. So I wanted to mention those up front. We'll send out a link to this when we send out a follow-up. If you'll go to the next slide, all the resources that we mention in this will also be in that email, and we'll do a recording of this as well. So don't feel like you need to be scrambling to take notes or anything like that. This is what we're basically going to cover today. What is indexing? And we're going to introduce you to some of the archivists we're going to be talking about. And then we're going to talk about choosing material, writing instructions, launching your projects, providing guidance to your transcribers, and then ending your projects. Ending is something new that we've started talking about a lot more, because thinking about starting with the end in mind is always a good idea. And there's some things to think about there. And then we'll have time for Q&A.
So let's talk about what indexing is. So in our software FromThePage, indexing is asking users to transcribe specific elements of a digitized document into structured data fields. And the structured data fields are really important, right? So this is an Alabama World War I service card. And you can see that the volunteers are asked to separate out different portions of the name that they see in the card. So, Lemon Z. Williams shows up, and the form layout that they're asked to type in separates Williams, Lemon, and Z. You'll also notice that people are not requested to type in this sort of their soldier serial numbers, stuff, the rank, the history of transfer, right? So this is kind of structured information from the originals, but it's not all of the information from the originals.
Right, there's this trade-off. How much work do you ask volunteers to do, and how much data do you really want or need or can use?
Right. What is the purpose this will be put to is an important question. Right. So the project owner configured the specific fields to be indexed and the format to display them in, and matching format to the format of the form, we're learning is actually a really important way to reduce errors. So indexing can also include spreadsheet style projects. This is a project that indexes the slave schedule to the 1860 United States Census. So you've got different structured data that's being indexed, including these page level fields, right? The stuff from the header on the census form. But there's also a spreadsheet to create multiple records per page. So for us, at least, indexing differs from full text transcription. This example has every word transcribed from a letter, right? These are very different kinds of processes. So our indexing features were developed by and originally for state and national archives. So funding and guidance for these features came from the Council of State Archivists, which is kind of an umbrella organization for state archives in the United States.
One of the things we love is that they can say we really need this. We're willing to help fund the development of it, but then everyone benefits from it,
right?
Which is lovely. So we're going to talk a lot about projects from two different organizations today, the Alabama Department of Archives and History and the Missouri State Archives. So we wanted to kind of introduce you to the cast of characters because it's always great to put a face with a name. On the left is Meredith McDonough. She's an archivist and a digital assets coordinator at Alabama. And then we have Steve Murray, who's the state archivist. And then on the right is Christina Miller. She's the reference services manager at the Missouri State Archives, and John Dugan, who's the state archivist in Missouri. So we just kind of, these are real people who are doing real projects, and now you have some faces to go with the names. So what material should be indexed? So let's talk for a minute about what kind of materials you might want to index. So index-worthy material. So often this type of material access is really hard. If you have a list that has 50 names on it, and that's part of a 200-page ledger or record, how is someone going to track down their individual name from that document, or the name of their ancestor or the person they're researching? So access is hard. This really increases access for this type of material. Similarly to what I just said, users need page level indices, right? They don't care that someone's mentioned in this book. They care that someone's mentioned on this page. And really, if you could tell them which line, they'd be even happier, right? We find that people do a lot of these projects because there's lots of named individuals. There's other types of material that are totally index worthy. We'll talk about some as we go through this presentation, but the vast majority of these projects are lists of names, tax records, birth or baptism records, all sorts of things that just have lots of names. But the other case that we see is indices to other documents. So many archives have handwritten indices to other documents in their collection, and those are great to index because now you have a digital index to documents that maybe you will never transcribe, but now people can find them and know that it's of interest to them. So this is a registration oath from Alabama, and I loved this quote from Meredith. She's like, she knows that they were never going to scan everything that Alabama Department of Archives and History has in their physical records. Similarly, they will never transcribe everything they have digitized, but they're focusing on collections that would most benefit from extensive transcription, like this registration oath. This is a handwritten index from the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. They're transcribing an index to court cases. So those court cases are really hard to find unless you page through the digital images of the original index, which is kind of, not fun and hard to do. So they've been working to transcribe just the index. But what they did with the index once it was transcribed is Brian Thomas, he's the electronic records librarian at Texas, built a lookup table on the Texas Digital Archive. So this really increases the findability of these documents and the likelihood that the court case records will be used. So we thought this was really clever because it really just is import a spreadsheet and then set up some lookup fields for each field in the spreadsheet. Let's talk a little bit about writing instructions for your volunteers. We support 3 different types of help within FromThePage. So we're going to talk about inline instructions first. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see this is from the Missouri State Archives, and they've added these instruction blocks, right? And what's cool about these is they are in line with the fields that you're asking volunteers to fill out. And you can set them up to be whatever you want, but we love this because it's kind of in their face, in transcribers' face, so they will read this. They don't always read longer instructions that people might choose to write because we all don't read instructions, right? But when they're here, then the answer is right there when you have a question, or it's kind of there, so people do see it. Let's see, individual instructions format versus expectation. So one of the interesting things here is you can ask transcribers to interpret as they transcribe. So in this case, What are they asking to do that's different? I'm trying to see. So I think that we're changing, yes, last name and first name is different from the page to what they're doing, because they know that they're going to want to look up by last name. You can skip things. You can ask people to write years in very particular formats because you want that year to be standardized. The other thing that's really interesting that they've done is they've added a notes field off to the right. And that notes field, is there over here underneath where we can't read it because we have all of our, yes. So the notes field is great because people are going to run across things that are weird, interesting, you have a question about. And from the page, we're not showing it on this, but at the very bottom of the page, we have a place for notes and questions, which is great, especially when you're doing full text transcription. But we found that with the spreadsheet style transcription, often your note or your question or your, hey, this was my great-great-grandfather comment that you want to make, it ties to the specific record, to the line here. So they've added this notes field so that if people run into problems or have those kind of comments to make, they have a place to put it. You may choose to use and review that as part of kind of your review process as you go work through this project or export this project. You may throw it away before you import it into some other system, but it gives people a place to make those comments and for you to look at them.
So the other place that we surface help and instructions is in the transcription conventions for the page itself. Right? And these are kind of general transcription conventions. This example is from the Queensland State Archives and from the project where they're transcribing this index to male prisoners admitted in Her Majesty's Prison in Brisbane. And so what they're doing here is saying things like, okay, for prison number and year, here's what we want you to enter. So enter the prison number, then a / and then 4 digits for the year, which means even though, you know, they might start with 93, that's 1893. We need you to actually type the 18 as well.
The other thing that's interesting here is they have instructions for what to do about ditto marks. So a lot of times handwritten spreadsheet indexy sort of things have ditto marks, so they don't have to rewrite the name above it. And they're asking people to go ahead and enter that name and not the ditto marks. The cool thing about our spreadsheet entry is you can actually copy and paste as well.
And this is something that we feel is kind of different from text transcription, where text transcription, you'd ask people to retain original things like ditto marks. Indexing is different. It's this kind of additional level of interpretation where you can say, well, you know, to make this useful, if we're going to be searching these records out of context of, you know, we actually need you to
make it a spreadsheet.
the ditto marks, right?
Yeah. So we have a third type of help. And it's what we call our help tab. And I've got a couple different examples of this from a couple different projects. So this is an example from the Wisconsin Historical Society. So one of the cool things they did is they annotated an image to point to different fields so that it was, you know, really clear when they labeled a field in the transcription, which part of this card they were talking about.
Right. I mean, you're actually helping people interpret what they're seeing as well.
The next 4 slides are all taken from the help tab of Alabama's voter registration books project. So this is really extensive. Meredith created text that gave people a guide to the collection, some general instructions for handling common issues like irregular spellings or illegible text. Go next. Hints on navigating from the page and finding the project when working within the project. They also included another annotated scan, similar to what Wisconsin did, with an explanation of each field that they're collecting.
Yeah, this is so cool.
Yeah, but it's pretty, I mean, it's kind of intimidating, right? This is a lot of help. But Alabama's been running these projects for 4 years. So they've been able to build on each previous project. But what's cool is you can build on their practices too. So you don't have to figure out what's going to work or what people are going to want to know. You can say, well, let's go see what other people who've been doing this for a while have done. And then, you know, pick and choose which of those seem appropriate for your project. Some transcribers like having something they can print out and have next to them. So Alabama actually links from their help page to their PDF project guide. And this is actually exactly the same information that's in the help tab, just reformatted for PDF. So after you've uploaded material and defined your instructions, you might want to do a soft launch. I would argue that you should be doing this soft launch kind of in tandem with writing your instructions, because the things that you learn from your launch process will help you improve your documentation and project. In fact, the cool thing about especially our transcription conventions and that help tab is you can go in and you can update them every day if you want to. Every time you learn something new that people have problems or questions with, you can choose to update those.
So after you've kind of tested everything out and given the project a shakedown cruise, it's time for your public launch. You can hold an event at the very beginning of a project and bring in the people who are active in genealogy organizations or historical organizations or descendant communities. So one of the things that these in-person or launch events, even if they're online, help with is that you can introduce the material and the project goals to potential participants, right? You give hands-on instructions, and that gets people over the discomfort of what am I doing here? Is my work good enough?
How do I use the software?
How do I use the software? In fact, the Library of Virginia has done some pretty extensive analysis of the different ways of doing like instruction videos, or here's project guides and PDFs. And they have concluded that the best way to give instructions and to train potential volunteers are these events. It's the hands-on, back and forth. Hey, I spotted something weird. What does this mean? This is doing something unexpected. What does this button do? Those kinds of things. They find that really, really works well, right? The volunteers who participate in these can go and take that enthusiasm and knowledge back to their communities as well and help bring other people on board and train them, right? Launch events are also great publicity. So the Julian Bond Transcribathon, like they're promoting their hashtag in a poster, and we've got a tweet by somebody who is doing a lot, like a video walkthrough where he's walking into the room where they're transcribing and narrating the whole way. Like it's really cool. Over here on the right-hand side, you see a volunteer at a transcribathon at Cambridge who's saying, woohoo, I'm getting to learn how to read medieval handwriting, right? That's fantastic, and it spreads the word more. So the Missouri State Archives does a fascinating exercise at their launch events. So after they've explained the format of the material and they gave people instructions on how to index each field, John, the state archivist, starts to index a page, right, on a projector screen that everyone can see. And he's terrible at it. So the participants who are there yell out what he's doing wrong, making corrections, telling him, oh, you missed this, you're typing in the wrong field, or no, that's not the decedent's surname, that's their spouse's surname.
Or this is not how you spell that, that was an H, not a W. Or
Right. And it makes the volunteers more confident in their skills, and it reinforces whatever lessons you're trying to communicate. And like it gets them over this hump, this intimidation factor, because like they just corrected the state archivist. They're better at this than he is, right? That's really cool. So promoting the project through social media is also important. It can be ongoing. Meredith says that they've been stunned by the number of people who learn about their projects through virtual word of mouth, right? So tweets, retweets, shares, likes, things like that actually do bring people in. So Alabama does something kind of interesting. They keep their large FromThePage projects private. So you can't kind of navigate to them if you're just anyone, right? They add collaborators to that project after they've contacted Meredith. So Meredith promotes these projects, people contact her, and then she has this direct relationship with them and adds them to the project. Meredith says that these emails that come in are kind of interesting because like they often begin with, I just saw a post about your project on Facebook or whatever, or I'm not from Alabama, but it's interesting to get that connection.
So we've also seen is that local news channels, both print and television, pick up these projects because they're interesting, they're visual. You have cool documents, you have people that can come in and take a picture of, And they're feel-good stories. They're a way for the local community and retirees to contribute to your mission of preserving memories. So this is some coverage by a local TV station of a project from the Seattle Municipal Archives. And I love this shot because you've got Jeannie Fisher, who's the archivist, and behind her, you've got all these old records, and she's got some in front of her. So it's just, it's kind of beautiful, and it really captures the project and what they're trying to do.
Traditional print media coverage is also important. The two busiest days we've ever seen on our software platform were over the Christmas holidays, when a couple of newspapers published articles about a project at the North Carolina State Archives. People were, I guess, with their families and looking for something meaningful to do together, or perhaps looking to escape their families and do something productive. But just the response to these news articles was overwhelming. So let's talk about providing guidance as projects go, right? One challenge for volunteer projects is to gently correct people who are not following the instructions, or maybe they're enthusiastically following the wrong instructions because they worked on a different project that had different rules, different guidelines. And volunteers want to do good work. So let's talk about like what happens when you encounter someone who's kind of doing the wrong thing. So we saw that with a transcription project that the British Library ran. They were transcribing Arabic scientific manuscripts that were really old. Like some of these went back to the 12th century. So they held a launch event in London that was really well attended. That seeded the project with a lot of volunteers that understood the instructions well. But late in the project, a new volunteer discovered it somehow, maybe social media or something, and they started correcting the medieval spellings of Arabic into modern Arabic spelling, which is not what the goals of the project were. So the project staff were able to intervene by like leaving notes on the pages the user had edited, and they gave some gentle guidance and encouragement to the user, saying, you know, hey, check out this link and things like that. So one
of the things I was going to point out is some of our projects have choose to turn on review. And if you turn on review, we have a review tab that project owners can see. And one of the things we highlight is brand new people or people who've just done a single page, because those are both people you should look at early because maybe they need some of this guidance. But
the challenge is, you know, individual correction can still drive volunteers away. Telling someone you're doing it wrong can be really demotivating.
Yeah, nobody
right?
wants to hear you're doing it wrong,
no
right?
matter how tactful you are. So the Missouri State Archives addresses this problem by sending these kind of correction emails to volunteers that are kind of messing things up, that look like regular updates to the entire volunteer pool. They're highlighting the issue that they're seeing, and they're reminding all the volunteers of what their expectations are. The trick is that the email only goes to the volunteer who is having this problem, right? So this is a way to kind of gently intervene and
but not call someone out.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So a lot of psychology to crowdsourcing projects.
So let's talk about what happens to projects after they're done. So there's two things to think about here: what happens to the volunteer community and what happens to the data. So just like we have a responsibility not to waste volunteers' labor, we feel like successful projects realize that volunteers make social connections through their work and have formed a real community. So when a project ends, volunteers can be sad to lose that experience. So one option is to point them to other projects at your institution, like you see in this social media post. But you might not have a project ready, or maybe the projects that you do have don't match their skills or their interests. So another option is to point volunteers to similar projects at other institutions while reassuring them that you'll let them know about new projects at your own institution when they're available, right? So that mailing list is an important thing to keep, right?
And that's easy to pull out of FromThePage if people have opted in.
So this email example goes out to the current volunteers for Missouri's projects, but they also go out to former volunteers who might have moved on to other institutions' projects, but they'd like to return to Missouri when a new project is done. And we do see people moving from one project to another. So this is a graph of one volunteer's contributions to 4 different projects at 3 state archives, not at Alabama, after the Alabama project was finished, right? So you can see this person moving from one project to another, and how many different index cards or indexing
Some of them are
cards they worked on, right?
Yeah. So it's also important to acknowledge your volunteers in some way at the end of the project. I like here how Meredith gives a count of volunteer records for each of these projects. So the World War I service cards, says nearly 80 virtual volunteers helped to digitally transcribe more than 100,000 Alabama service records. What she doesn't say is in 2.5 months, which is a pretty amazing amount of work. The next slide, this is a social media post by a historian who's running a project called the Lone Rock Stockade Convict Ledgers Project. And she's talking about how much labor her volunteers contributed to the project and just how thankful she is for that work.
So the other part of finishing a project is extracting data. So FromThePage supports several different export formats. I think we're close to 24 now. Some indexing projects use more than one. So it's important to figure out where your exported data will go, right? So this is a spreadsheet export of the Alabama World War I service card project. Meredith pulled the material out and then used it to re-index their collections within Content DM. So previously, you had digital stacks of cards, right? So you had top-level metadata saying these are the people from Baldwin County, and these are surnames A through F, right? So you kind of had to visually page through these stacks of maybe 400, 300 pages each. So she was able to re-index all of that using this material into single card indexes, right? So think about what that means to users who are doing research, how much time it saves, right? How much easier it is to make the record findable. So this is a similar spreadsheet export of the description book from Police Jail Fortitude Valley by the Queensland State Archives. So this was a spreadsheet transcription project, and the data that's exported is very similar. So this is a great starting point for analytical research work. Library of Virginia, in addition to uploading their own finding aids, they upload the data sets into the Virginia Open Data Portal for academic researchers to use, for anyone really. So that same description book from Fortitude Valley, you can see exported as HTML. So HTML is not as useful for indexing projects, but updating library systems with human readable transcripts is still valuable. So what if you don't have a place to put spreadsheet exports from ledger style data, or you're working with a system that just has a single plain text transcript field because it's used to the output from OCR engines or something? So this is our page level text export. It's human readable, it's searchable, and it's also kind of future proof because it's a machine readable format called Markdown. There's websites where you could take this, cut and paste what you see here into the website, and then it would give you an Excel file.
Or an HTML, or
Yes.
there's lots of different ways you can go from this to something else.
So we want to leave you with this quote from Meredith about their perspective, which I think is really valuable. And then we'll open up the call for discussion. I will tell people that I did hit mute all at one point, but you should all be able to unmute. And if you can't, please let me know in the chat and I will fight Zoom on your behalf. The chat as well. And
Okay, some questions.
okay.
Let's see. Michael says, can we put inline notes in our journal format as it is currently set up? So Michael's at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and they already have, I'd have to look at how you have your journals set up.
So they're doing, they're not using indexing, it's more of a pure transcription project. And I think the answer is, we need to look at it,
Yeah.
but I think you'd want to use the footnote tag.
Oh, that's
this case,
interesting.
which is a new tag we just added. So we'll
We'll
look
go
it with you.
yeah,
Yeah.
specifically, yes.
So I'm going to stop presenting. Sorry, stop sharing my screen so people can actually see us. And so just feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions or comments, or if you have things in the
To tell us about your collections or
yeah.
Hi, thanks, Ben and Sarah. Thanks, and yeah, it's not on the topic of today about indexing, but yeah, if there's a way to do footnoting that's not too complicated, might be interested in that.
Yeah.
It just seems to me that we just came to the platform a couple of years too late because we just did massive amount of lists.
Oh
no. There are more to do though. So this kind of feeds off a question that I think I might have asked an email a day or two ago about, and maybe it's a little off topic. If you want to deal with it separately, you can, but how best to import certain kinds of things into that are half done, so we can then finish them in from the page.
Yeah, so the challenge with imports is that we always need to be able to connect the portion of text that was transcribed to the page image that it corresponds to. So if people have just plain text files, one per image, that's really easy to import. If someone has gone and created a Word document that is everything all together, then we're stuck doing copy and paste because we have no way to tell when one page starts and another one ends. I should let me continue here for a minute. I should mention that we do not currently support importing half-done data or indexing projects. So these field-based projects, that's not really something that's available yet. We're having conversations about it, I think, next week, but it's not even on our roadmap currently.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions or comments from anyone? Yes, Janet. You'll need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
This is so fascinating and exciting. How do you review the work of the transcribers when they're doing indexing on essentially a spreadsheet? I mean, how do you review each person's entry, and also can somebody add to what someone else has already put in if there's an additional piece of information that comes up later that someone else finds?
Right. So there's a couple of questions there. So one is, if one person transcribes, can someone else come behind later and make updates or changes? So FromThePage was built with the same model that Wikipedia was built with, which is called collaborative knowledge creation. We believe that together we're a lot smarter than any of us individually. So what that means for FromThePage projects is I can do a transcription and then Ben can come back behind me or later, or a year later if you leave it up, and make changes to what I did. So that's always available up until the point where the institution can either lock it down or make it private or export it and delete it completely, whatever they choose to do. The second question was about review. We have multiple levels of review, and the challenge with review is the more review you want to do, the more work it is for staff. So we tell two stories. One is the Maryland State Archives has an ongoing project where they transcribe marriage certificates. And these marriage certificates are actually vital records. Many of the people who are in the marriage certificates are still living.
Right, I should say this is unusual for a crowdsourcing project where we're used to dealing with like 19th
Historical.
century records. These are marriage certificates from the 1970s and 1980s. Right.
But they didn't have an index for them, and it was really hard to find a particular marriage certificate. In fact, after they had been doing this for a while during COVID, we got an email that Liz, the project manager there, had sent to all of their transcribers saying, you know, thank you so much for your work. This morning, someone asked for a marriage certificate because they needed to prove they were married in order to get COVID care for someone that was in the hospital. And I was able to pull this marriage certificate for them within, 20 minutes because we had indexed it, right? Whereas previously the implication was this was not very easy to do at all, like people in the archives paging through things and stuff, right? Okay, so the challenge is these are vital records, so they have to be right. So Maryland reviews every single one of them with a staff person reviews every single one of them. In order to do that, they were having people like pull out large chunks of their week in order to do that review, which is a lot of work. And I'm going to tell you about what we did to try to make that better and easier in a minute. The other example we talk about is Library of Virginia has a textual transcription project of,
I think it's colonial court records.
Handwritten colonial, records that they had nothing for, right? There are very little metadata, no transcripts. And so their attitude is anything is better than nothing. So they don't do much review. They just pull it into their systems so that those documents are now more findable and searchable.
Yeah, the minute a page is transcribed or half transcribed, right? That night it gets copied into their system. If somebody updates it and improves it, well, their system gets updated and improved, right? But anything is better than nothing is their attitude, and they don't want to put the labor in to review this and make sure everything is perfect because
they don't have time,
yes,
right? So one thing that we built after seeing kind of Maryland's approach to these marriage certificates and a lot of conversations with the Council of State Archivists is, so we've always had a way to say, okay, every page in this project needs review. So once it's been transcribed the first time, it gets marked needs review. And anyone in this particular configuration, anyone can come in and review that page and then say it's been reviewed. So volunteers can do that. And if you choose to go down that path, you should encourage your volunteers to do that. But reviewing is not as much fun as transcribing. So we may not choose to do that, right? So that's where that's kind of the trade-off. Then we have a third kind of level of review, from nothing to optional sort of review by anyone to you can do required review, and only specified reviewers can review it. And when you go down that path, and actually the previous one too, we give you this review tab that I mentioned earlier. And we do a couple of different things. We show you people who are brand new. So we kind of would encourage project managers to come in and review new transcribers early on, because those early interventions can kind of help you train people and steer them in the right way. And then we also show kind of one-hit wonders, people who come by, transcribe one page or one record and then go, because you're like, yeah, I better go review those people, right? But then we also have what we call a sampling approach. So, you might be familiar with this concept, and like we use it for a lot of medical testing and things like that, where you sample a population for public health purposes. So what we do is we say, okay, we want enough pages to represent every transcriber, and we want enough pages to represent every kind of subset of documents you have. So we call them works, but if you have a pile of cards, it's not exactly a work. But and because what we know is, like, one county may have really easy to read material, and the next county over may never have cleaned their typewriter, or the clerk had terrible handwriting or something. So we know that this is harder than this to read. And so we put together a minimal set, the smallest set we can, that covers all your transcribers and all of your subsets of material. And we ask you to review those. Maybe it's 15 pages, maybe it's 500. It kind of depends on how big your project is and how many contributors you have and stuff. It's rarely 500. And when you're done with that, we look at what you had to correct from the original transcription to your reviewed transcription. And we look at how different those two were. If you had to change 20 words, that's a pretty big level of correction. If you only had to make, 2 character changes, that's a pretty small correction. And we look at them as percentages. And then we use those percentages to surface things that maybe you should look at first. This county is worse than this other county. This transcriber might, make more mistakes than another transcriber. And, that's the data that we try to present so that when you choose to do your reviews, you're doing the highest impact work. But think really hard whether you want to do reviews.
Right. It really depends
Yeah.
on what the material.
Right. And then also what we've seen, like what Library of Virginia does, is they promote volunteers to be reviewers. So it's an honor to be a reviewer, and it is, right? I mean, it's, the material and you're really good. So there's other kind of ways to do that. Okay, I talked a lot about that, but it's a complicated topic.
So we've got a question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we've got a question from Catherine Lee at the Toronto Public Library asking about examples of crowdsourcing subject headings using a controlled vocabulary.
Mhm.
So yeah, this is something that indexing projects tend to actually want a lot. So the controlled vocabulary features that we have in FromThePage are defined by you currently. We don't hook into Library of Congress or things like that yet. So for example, the World War I Service Cards Project out of Alabama used a controlled vocabulary for branch of service. So Army, Navy, nursing, I think. They used one for race. I think they might have used one for county. I know the Maryland State Archives example with their marriage certificates, they're using one for county. But you have to think about what fields are important for this controlled vocabulary for, right? You don't want a controlled vocabulary for people's names, but maybe you really do want one for these fields that, it's not a value add to know that someone had a typo in the name of a county, right? That's not really that useful.
So you can put those lists in for both the field-based and the spreadsheet. And the field-based, it's a drop-down, and your transcribers can choose from your drop-down what the field is, or they can start typing and it matches what's in the drop-down. The spreadsheet,
it works slightly different since people are usually, hands on keyboards and don't want to switch to their mouse. That's an autocomplete field where you start typing and it suggests, whatever you want to choose, and you pick whatever and you keep going. The spreadsheet field, because that, we actually originally made that a drop down, and then we started looking at real world data, and you look at things like, years or stuff that the verbatim text actually sometimes is really important to capture. So people can type something that's not in the controlled vocabulary. It visually, the system visually flags that data as being weird, right? That the cell is colored red, but if that's what things really said and the user is really sure, then hitting save makes sense.
Yeah, never mind, nothing else. Sorry.
Any other questions or comments?
So we're always happy to schedule a Zoom call with individual institutions to talk about your material, look at your material, brainstorm different approaches for transcribing or indexing it, and walk you through from the page and kind of scenarios of how you might choose to use that. So we'll make sure you have that information in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah, we like to look at sample material and then talk about the goals of the project and then figure out, how we can do this. And Michael can attest that we sometimes have to go around a few times before we can figure things out. Last chance for questions. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go share again the next two webinars,
and we would love any help you have on lists or other places, social media, people who might also really enjoy some of this material. We love, I'm still trying to get back there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Particularly when we invite other speakers. And we
good showing.
yeah, we hate to have them talking to an empty room.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you all for coming. Successful.